Thank you. And may I say what pleasure it is for me to be at Bryn Mawr and to meet all these nice people. I assume I've heard from a few that you've been cramming up on the chaconne of Bach. This puts me in a rather difficult position because I'm not likely, in that case, to tell you anything new, or if it's new, it might be wrong. But we have chosen this piece because it is one of the great milestones in music. You only have to widen your mind and your vision to look at the chaconne in its relation to the rest of the work, of which it is but one and the final movement, and then again consider that whole partita, as it is called, in relation to the other 5 works of the series, because the whole series consists of 6 works. They are called sonatas and partitas, and indeed that is the scholastically correct academic way of referring to them. For the sonatas are those including fugues, and the partitas are the suites. In other words, a succession of movements which originally were dances and which already in Bach's day were stylized. But for practical purposes, as it is rather mouthful to say sonatas and partitas, we often call them the 6 sonatas for violin alone. One can see the most incredibly organized and ordered mind, almost like a mechanical computer, an electronic calculating machine. Just analyzing the choice of keys is interesting in that each is in a different key, and the keys are particularly well chosen. They proceed in a symmetrical way from G to B, and then from A to D. The reason why he goes a fourth is that he has to come back a note and doesn't want to repeat the C. A to D, C to E. And they are nicely symmetrically ordered, sonata, partita, sonata, partita, sonata, partita. And thus, every step in this great edifice, every element in it is related to each other. Just tune. Then, as I had lightly touched upon the fact that the chaconne was the last movement of this partita, I'd like to describe the other movements. The allemande, which begins, it is a very noble, even movement in one voice. I mean, there's only one voice playing. It consists of the implication of many voices. And it has, it's a wonderful quiet beginning. Now, I have heard violinists who begin this with a completely wrong idea, as again, they don't realize the many voices, and they, for sheer self-aggrandizement, for vanity, will play it on one string, and which is completely wrong, because it's not meant, you don't get the balance of voices that way. And then it's followed by the courante, which is very short and a fast movement in triplets, whereas the first movement is in 4 groups of 4 and is in 4/4. This is in 3 with triplets, 3/3/3, and it goes like this. Which is a very fine contrast to the first, as you can see. Then, and incidentally, all movements are marked by those descending 4 notes which find their apotheosis in the chaconne. That's the first one, C sharp, B flat, A. And then the courante has the same, C sharp, B flat, A. And now comes the sarabande, which is perhaps the most moving piece. It has an incredible pathos, and there you will perhaps recognize yourself the and the descending bass, which is characteristic, as I say, of this whole partita. And it's the rhythm of the chaconne, but without being quite the rhythm of the chaconne, because even though it's in 3 and it's a little slower, because it's the sarabande, there is no accent, no stress on the second beat, as in the chaconne. And this is the beginning of the sarabande. It goes on. You undoubtedly recognize those lower notes. Then the next movement, to provide a contrast and to refresh the listener for the chaconne, although not necessarily the performer, is a very fast movement and is called a jig. It goes like this. Goes on like that for about, 2.5 minutes. And then finally comes the chaconne itself. Now, the work itself, many of you have been through it. It's a very severe and strict discipline, very strict form, and yet it's a very free form. The strictness consists in the fact that the units are invariably of 8 bars divided into 4 and 4. Each bar has a different bass note, every 4 bars repeating the same series, descending 4 notes, which is characteristic of this particular form, as it is of the passacaglia. The difference being that the passacaglia has the accent always on the first beat, and the chaconne, it's a different type of dance, has its main stress on the second beat, though the first is also very important, but not on the third at all. And these 4 notes, D, C, or C sharp, B flat, A, and those keep repeating. And over these bass notes, and they're not always in the bass, but mostly in the bass, Bach builds the most fantastic edifice of sound and the most imaginative succession of variations. And the build-up is a fantastic thing as it proceeds from the statement of the theme. And then builds up to 2 great climaxes, and finally to the ultimate one, which is purely the 8 bars restated with the final end. I've mentioned the climaxes. There's a little more to it than that. You will notice various places. The great junction of the whole chaconne occurs where the major enters. to return to this major chord, it occurs here. It's not the end of the phrase. The end of the phrase comes here, after which the new period comes. Which is a choral effect. Incidentally, Bartók also goes back to the choral effects in his Sonata for Violin Alone. This fact that this major chord comes in after we have built up a tremendous climax on the minor is an interesting thing, and I mark it by a special little weight when I play it. I do so on. It comes in the most natural way. It comes in as part of a harmonic, chromatic progression. And as such represents the climax of this movement and shows to Bach's delight with the newfound chromaticism of his day. If he knew where it would lead eventually, he probably would have his anxieties and doubts, just as our delight in our refrigerators and television and radio may be also open to abuse and possibilities which may lessen their present usefulness. And so there is another great junction in this work where, as you can imagine, it returns to the D minor. It returns to the D minor with the B flat, which is a wonderful place at the end of the next great climax. This is the chord. Now, this is an extraordinary moment. I'll always remember it as Enesco described it. He was one of my great teachers, the greatest musician I studied with. And he likened this to the face on the medieval wood-carved Madonnas that one finds in Germany. And they have this expression of great pain and yet tremendous resignation. And it is not, in other words, a pain that is shouting. It's a very inner kind of pain. And this extraordinary chord is the musical equivalent of that feeling. And finally, the whole edifice is sealed with the beginning repeated again. The last 8 bars are almost the first 8 bars. To give you an idea about academic discussions of interpretation, I don't know that any of you will ever apply it, but it will give you an idea about the kind of things that concern musicians and musicologists, and the kind of differences of opinion which exist between the mind that studies intellectually and academically and the mind that is concerned with the projection of a piece to an audience and to oneself, for that matter. Bach writes this: the top voice is a dotted quarter with an eighth. Quarter. The harmonies are written in whole notes. And they are not dotted, they are continuous. Now, of course, the academic mind would feel that those notes must last the whole time which they have to last. You see, like that. Which, for one thing, is almost impossible to play, because you need an enormous pressure to play it. You cannot be consequent, because when the four strings come, you cannot possibly play all those together. And Bach knew all that very well. And then there comes one point where it would be definitely wrong, because you would have 2/5 superimposed, which he certainly never meant here. Therefore, they don't do that, but they turn a blind eye to that, if they are of that particular cast of I didn't mean a pun. And the rhythm is the important thing there. It's important not to weighten the third beat or the last eighth, which is the upbeat to the next. In other words, you know where you are. And that is the kind of discussion which I consider, when it occurs, fruitless, because I can dispose of it in this manner rather summarily. Others do break the chord and repeat it like this, which is an even worse compromise, because it's not consistent at all. They don't. Bach did not repeat the note. He wrote it out as one unit. Therefore, if you repeat it, you violate it as much as if you dropped it altogether and didn't repeat it at the end of the bar. So I believe that the right thing is to hold it as long as you can, give the bass, the harmony, its importance, and then drop it in favor of the concise rhythm. Now, where Bach wants the chord repeated, he does. There's a place later on, in the last third of the piece, where he deliberately writes all three voices in a dotted quarter, and then again all three on the upbeat, like this. There it's deliberate, because we are in a kind of expression of great richness and sonority, and we are in the middle of the piece when the rhythm has been established, and it's not necessary. He just wants sound. He wants rich, voluminous sound, and he writes it in three voices too, which can be done. And very often these discussions lead to the question of whether the round bow, which was still used in Bach's day, and which can play many notes, all four strings simultaneously, is preferable for Bach's music to the modern bow, which was already invented in his day in Italy, and of which he may have known. I feel he knew about it, because many of the rhythmic details of annotation in the chaconne are very interesting, in that they are just for the length that one can keep the note and for no more, like this. He writes just the chord. Even the bass, which normally he would write as a half note, he writes as a dotted eighth, so that obviously he meant it to be short, just to leave the rest of the bar clear. And that proves, to me at least, that he didn't want to sacrifice the rhythmic structure and the weight on the second beat and on the first beat in favor of mere indiscriminate sound. I mentioned that it is a severe form and at the same time a free fantasy, and I think these two conceptions of freedom and law strictness, of discipline with fantasy are identical in a way. They are two sides of the same coin. I don't think it is possible to have one without the other. And I think we make a great mistake in our world to assume that we can have one only at the expense of the other. The only thing we must remember is that the less discipline we have within ourselves, the more it will have to be imposed from the outside. And the greater freedom we want in the outside world, the more discipline we must impose on ourselves from within ourselves. And this is, again, a law, a natural law, which is true in all art. There's never been any great art without any great discipline, any great form. I mean, you have to have a form which you can then twist and alter and change. The same thing applies to rhythm in the interpretative way. You cannot possibly have an inspiring and free performance, an interpretation, unless you have a very strict conception and basic conception of the rhythm. Now, by strictness, it's an important thing for a young audience to realize, because again, as with freedom and discipline, as with good and bad, and with many other such half-baked conceptions of isolated worlds, with bearing no relation to each other, of isolated opposites. There are no such thing as isolated opposites. Opposites are by their very nature dependent on each other. And many audiences today do not have a good yardstick of judgment. They will judge perhaps a performance, some will judge it for its mechanical perfection and decide that if the performance follows a metronome, then it's a good performance. And then others who go for an emotional experience, they may often have no sense of style. And thus you have to realize that both the strictness and above it, the freedom, are essential to performance. I'd like to compare the freedom of interpretation with the decoration of a room. When you would decorate a room, you wouldn't consider starting to decorate it if it were still cluttered with 1,000-odd bric-a-brac. You couldn't then bring your own qualities to it. And the same thing applies to perfect and strict rhythm. You begin with working at a thing so that it is perfectly in rhythm. But after that, there are many, many considerations which necessitate the slightest application of the spice of diversity, the spice of nonconformism, which are all right, certain eccentricities which are essential to making it right, which it wouldn't be if it remained mechanically even. Perhaps I can go into some of these which might be of interest to you. Well, as one example, take a series of 16 notes which are in the even division of 4 times 4, and you have this, which is, the seventh bar of the beginning of the first movement of this partita, of which the chaconne is the last movement. I take it as an example because it consists of even notes which to anybody looking at it like that would say they have to be played evenly. Well, they have to be played evenly and they have to be worked evenly, but there's more to it. This is the way they go. Now, first of all, there are two voices, if not more, in this example. So that the importance of seeing that there are two voices, three voices, sometimes four voices, in a progression, in a single voice progression of notes is terribly important, because in that you have the latent harmony, the innate harmony, which must come out. Now, you can all see that if a thing becomes entirely predictable, as a mechanical rhythm would, it would be like playing it on the piano, where you would imagine then that the same hand or the same voice is playing the whole succession of notes. You wouldn't realize that it's a different voice coming in. It would sound like this. But it wouldn't be plastic enough, because you wouldn't realize that this is the bass voice and is the soprano voice, and this is the possible middle voice, and again the soprano, and again the bass. Now, there are many other considerations that make each of these notes important in a different way. You have here also the succession of four notes which are in a scale form, and are four notes like this. And then you have 3 and 3, which are rather tender. And in fact, Bach writes a tie over each of these 3 notes to indicate that he does feel that they are 3 and 3 coming after 4 and 4. Thus you have already the voice difference and the rhythmic element. Now you have many other elements that come in as well. You have melodic elements, a jump, for instance, which is important. You have the breathing, which is important, as here. This is the beginning of a new period. You have also the dynamic differences. In other words, you must decide whether this is to be louder or softer than the upper voices. Then, because this is the end of a phrase returning to the first note, the key note, you want to fall back to it. You want to make a little diminuendo. You don't want to keep it completely even. As this note is also the highest note, because it is the highest, it also merits a special consideration. Because it is off the beat and is the first of the group of 3, it merits particular consideration. Because it is a note which doesn't belong to the chord of D, but is the last note of the dominant and resolves to D minor, it deserves a special emphasis. Thus, all these considerations must come in if a note is higher or lower than others, if it belongs to the chord, if it doesn't, which voice it belongs to, and so on. As I mentioned before, Bach's mind was like a fantastic calculating machine. Everything came out, the answers came out right instinctively. And that is where instinct comes in, because our instinct is our calculating machine, in that we cannot ever think through 10,000 things. When I play it through, I don't think of all these things. I've thought of them in my time, and I can still think of them again if I want to explain them, as I'm doing now. But once they are assimilated, then the answers come automatically, and that is what's called instinct. I do it right if I am in a certain mood and approach it with the right dedication and humility and understanding, and if I've worked on the fingers so that they can obey my least impulses, and provided I can play it straight too, then the answer, the performance will come out right, and it will be, I don't guarantee it right now, but it will be not entirely even. It'll be something like this. You see? Now, that is not entirely even, and yet, if you began with the beginning of the movement, you would feel that there was a continuous rhythm which was fairly strict. It was built on a strict rhythm. And that is exactly what I mean by the synthesis of freedom and discipline. The reason why I feel the chaconne is so great is that it was written for a stringed instrument. Already in Bach's day, again because of the chromatic trend, the piano the harpsichord was beginning to assert its importance. The violin in those days was still the supreme instrument. Apart from the organ, which was the loudest instrument of its day, undoubtedly, the violin was the strongest instrument in actual volume of sound. And that is important to consider. It was also the carrier of all the melodic invention of the day, and even more than the voice, has a greater range, and also can, unlike the voice, can within itself, express polyphony. And therefore it is more representative of that day than would be the harpsichord, which already was leaning towards the future, eventually giving way to the piano, and as harmonies became more important and dominated the melodic and the contrapuntal structure. Gradually music moved in a kind of a changing angle from the horizontal gradually to the vertical. Now it is, and people spoke a little while ago of clusters of notes. Well, that is purely vertical. And it's a curious thing. You can relate it also to the psychology of the day. People in those days lived horizontally in time, too, in that they had a continuity of time, which we today have largely lost in favor of an intensity of the moment and the complication of the moment, which is again the vertical and the instantaneous. They had a continuous contact with the past and with the future through infinity and eternity, for they believed in eternity. They believed in a future life. Bach's music is religious, and in that sense, too, his music is at the bridge of the epochs between the end of music for sacred purposes only and the beginning of music for lay pleasure and enjoyment at any time of the day or night, as we now can turn on the radios whenever we want to, and without going to church. And that is, again, an interesting point. So you see how significant that moment, and in particular this piece, is. To elucidate a little on the greatness of Bach, on his all-encompassing powers, bridging the epochs, writing mostly sacred music, and yet writing lay music as well, and the feeling of continuity with the past and as it is projected into the future. It comes at a time when the contrapuntal development, the polyphonic development, in other words, of music had reached a very great height. The art of the fugue, all fantastic permutations and evolutions, involutions, every variety of contortion that could be applied to a theme, to a melody, to a line of notes, was applied to music in Bach's day. And he was perhaps the greatest of all, as can be readily proven by the art of the fugue, which he wrote as a pure expression of music. I didn't want to use the word exercise because it is so much more beautiful than would be expressed by the word exercise, and yet it doesn't apply to any particular instrument. He wrote it without any indication of instrument, merely as an expression of pure music. And that was at a time when already the innovation of the chromatic era was apparent. Bach took great pride in using the chromatic elements, which until his day had been shunned in favor of the modal. And the modal ones, of course, are very ancient. They come down to us not only from the Greeks, but undoubtedly pre-Greek. I would say that this great and gentle and continuous trend of influence, which has gone on since ages immemorial, from the East to the West, brought along these modes, and in our church music and medieval music, we hadn't yet abandoned them in favor of the chromatic. And this is a digression from Bach, but nonetheless completes the picture. And I would like to say that at this point in contemporary music, we are beginning to appreciate the modes again, and to have an ear for the Indian and the Indonesian and all the Oriental music that is still modal and that is beginning to seep into our culture and is already being adopted by many composers. This is again in itself not a new trend. Debussy and Ravel studied the Eastern modes very closely, and Bartók, who is to my mind and I think most musicians would agree, the greatest of the 20th century composers, he made a very intense and very deep study of Eastern European music and Eastern music as far as Turkey and all of North Africa and so on. So that is another example of how our composers from the Middle Ages, when they were using the modes, have always had recourse to this Eastern influx. The East having never abandoned the modes in favor of chromaticism, at least India, of which I can speak with a little knowledge. Well, in Bach's day, they were entering this new period, and Bach used the chromatic means very readily. In fact, he wrote in all the keys that we know, in the 24 keys, his preludes and fugues. One can see with what spontaneous joy and pleasure he involved himself. He explored the possibilities of these modulations, which until his day were fairly unknown. And the chromatic only came with the development of the well-tempered scale. In other words, when we finally decided that rather than maintain pure harmonies, pure in the sense of their relation to overtones, we would create some sort of an equality between all tones. That was also the period that anticipated the Renaissance and eventually the great revolutions that were to establish the kind of equality between people. And already there was a foreboding in the arts with chromaticism, which was the application of equality between notes. The modal world and the chromatic world. These two worlds met at Bach's time, and he used them both. And that explains the great richness of his music. And the chaconne is perhaps, as much as any other work of Bach, the greatest symbol of that high point of the meeting of these two periods. But therefore, that puts you in the frame, in the proper frame, to appreciate the climax of this great arc, which occurred in Bach's day, of which he was the keystone. Well, thank you all very much.